ahead.
Our mission, Helping Parents Heal, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting parents whose children have passed. Through support and resources offered, we aspire to help individuals become shining light parents, meaning a shift from a state of emotional heaviness to one of hopefulness and greater peace of mind. Helping Parents Heal goes a step beyond other groups by allowing the open discussion of spiritual experiences and afterlife evidence in a non-dogmatic way. Helping Parents Heal affiliate groups welcome everyone, regardless of religious or non-religious background, and encourage open dialogue. Attendance at this meeting is voluntary. We hope that participants will learn from and share with each other. Discussions here are confidential and not designed to replace traditional therapy or spiritual counseling. Zoom meetings run by leadership are not confidential. These meetings typically feature guest presenters and are posted on YouTube so that affiliate members worldwide can watch and benefit. Neither type of Helping Parents Heal meeting is designed to replace traditional therapy or spiritual counseling. Helping Parents Heal offers a wide variety of speakers, allowing parents to learn about many possible ways to heal. This includes presenters covering progressive topics such as afterlife evidence and connecting with our children who have passed. The views expressed by our guest speakers may or may not reflect the opinions of Helping Parents Heal leaders and members, so we ask that you take from their presentations whatever may benefit you personally. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you could join us, and thank you, Dr. Moody, for being here this evening.
Oh, thank you, folks. I mean, this is just such a wonderful thing. I
Yes, this is
appreciate it.
wonderful. And I just want to say, I wanted to say just a little bit about you before we launch into the interview, just because you are so important in what we do at Helping Parents Heal. And we're so grateful to you. And again, Dr. Raymond Moody's book, which I believe came out in 1975, which is Life, Afterlife, which has been translated into, I'm not even sure how many languages across the world. Do you know?
I think 40 something, I think. I'm
40
not sure.
something languages. It was truly one of the most important parts of my healing to read that book, but also being able to see you in person at different conferences. And it's interesting to me that that this book now is talking about shared death experiences, which is obviously something that you hadn't spoken about in 1975. You were speaking about near-death experiences, but having this book be proof of the afterlife is very exciting. And anyway, I just wanted to tell everyone here what a kind man Dr. Moody is. I think that all of you have heard of his books, but he also is one of the most approachable professors that I've ever met, or doctors that I've ever met. And he has truly changed the way that we think about the afterlife. I'm just going to read a very short part of his bio. In 1975, I coined the term near-death experience in my book, Life After Life. For half a century, I have researched some of life's greatest mysteries. As both a PhD in philosophy and an MD, I have a strong interest in how medical realities intersect with the ineffable realm of philosophy. In my multiple roles as an author, professor, public speaker, and grief counselor, I have heard thousands of accounts of near-death, shared death, and after-death experiences. I never expected that my interest in the afterlife would become such a focus of my life's work, but it has led me to great associations, friendships, and insights. Throughout my 5-decade career, I have explored themes related to the personal aspects of death, dying, and grief. In my book, Glimpses of Eternity, I discuss the phenomena of shared death experiences. I write about my inquiry into past lives in my book, Coming Back. and share methods for evoking the dead from ancient Greece to modern times in my book, Reunions. I also have a passion for language, which I share with my colleagues and co-founder of the Life After Life Institute, Lisa Smart. My PhD in philosophy focused on unintelligibility, and my new book, which is the book that we discussed last summer, Making Sense of Nonsense, discussed what nonsense teaches us about consciousness and altered states of being. So this new book that just came out this past November, I believe, which is Proof of Life After Life, is the book that we'll be discussing today, but we'll also open the floor for questions. Please join me and Irene in welcoming the very esteemed and wonderful Dr. Raymond Moody. Welcome, Dr. Moody.
Well, thank you all so much for this. I'm just honored. I mean, I guess Elizabeth knows, but maybe not all the folks listening in know that I myself lost my first child in 1970 at the age of 36 hours. So I understand what you folks are going through. Let's put it that way. And I had studied near-death experiences for about 8 years by the time my son died. And I can't really say that it helped me. That was 1970. People didn't talk about grief, and I just didn't know what happened to me. It felt like an eclipse, right? Because people didn't talk about grief. 2 months after that, I had 2 major panic attacks. We didn't know what panic attacks were at that time either. But retrospectively, it's plain it was a hyperventilation reaction to the event I'd been through. So this has been a long fascination to me. I became fascinated by these near-death experiences by reading about them in Plato in 1962. And then I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, who in December of 1943, when he was a recruit in the Army, was pronounced dead for 9 minutes that they know of double lobar pneumonia. And Dr. Francie, the physician on the ward, injected him with adrenaline, and he came back to life. And George was the first person I knew living person I knew who had this experience. And it's taken a long time for me to come to the situation on it. I mean, I was a professor of logic, and I know very well the logical difficulties in trying to prove life after death. But from the time I first started being known of this, when I was a professor of philosophy at East Carolina University, I had heard these cases from my students and from my colleagues, and I started presenting on them to civic clubs and that sort of organization. And it just has taken a long time for me to figure out what this is all about. But as soon as I started, being known for this work, I got just a constant stream of people asking me, like, Raymond, do we have any proof that there's an afterlife? Well, as a professor of logic, the way I heard that in 1970 and 71 was my mind went to Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein and Frege. I mean, the founders of mathematical and symbolic logic. And so I would try to talk to people from that point of view. And I quickly realized, people's eyes would roll up. And it took me a long time to try to figure out, what are people asking when they ask me if there can be a proof of life after death? What I finally figured out that what people want to know is, they want to know, is it a rational thing to expect and anticipate that when you die, you will enter into another state of consciousness. And I say, absolutely, yes, it is. Now, in terms of the technical problems of logic, most people are not going to be interested in that, right? Especially people who are going through a loss of a loved one are not going to be wanting to talk about the niceties of logic. But for those folks like me who do like that kind of thing, um, um, that problem is now solved, and there's ways you can find out about that if you're interested in that. But I have finally reached the point in my long process with this that I give up. I guess many people who are listening to this have probably heard people say, "Oh, this is oxygen deprivation to the brain," is a common thing that people say. The trouble with that is that bystanders at the death of someone else who are not themselves ill or injured will have all of these markers that we think of as a near-death experience, and they are not ill or injured. So obviously something else is going on other than oxygen deprivation to the brain if the the um, the bystanders who are well are having the same experience. I first encountered this from one of my own medical school professors who told me about getting out of her body and looking down when she was trying unsuccessfully to resuscitate her mother. And she said she felt her mother die, she herself came up and she saw the scene down below, and then she saw her mother there beside her, now in spirit form, she said. She said her goodbyes to her mother and saw her mother recede into this tunnel and saw people, some of whom she recognized emerging from the tunnel, like going out to greet her mother. And I didn't talk about that in Life After Life because mainly because I couldn't think of any way to tell that story without potentially identifying my professor, and I didn't want to do that. But also because it was the only case I had, I couldn't make any, broader assessment than that. But subsequently, I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people who were there at the bedside of someone else, and that as the person in the bed died, the bystanders would say that I got out of my body and I went part way toward this light with my grandma, and then I came back and rejoined my body. People say the room changes configuration. They no longer feel like they're in a three-dimensional space, but in some other kind of intermediate space. People say the room fills with light. People talk about sometimes about seeing apparitions of the dying person's deceased relatives come in the room as though to take them away. And most remarkably to me, I have quite a number of cases of bystanders who empathically co-lived the dying life review of the person who passed away. And this is the most shocking thing I've learned from my whole career, because to tell you the truth, I'm hoping to get myself recused from my own life review, much less the idea there might be a spectator there, right? So what I'm getting at is that I think that I feel very confident now in assuring folks who are going through grief and so on that, yeah, this is the case, that when we die, we do go into another realm. And at the same time, I'd kind of like to point out to people that one thing I've heard from a lot of people with near-death experiences over the years is they say, in a way that I've heard people say, that they think that their near-death experience makes the grief even more severe in a way, because when somebody has a purely kind of intellectual or whatever, just or religious take on the afterlife and say, well, I know because of my faith, then then you don't. The trouble with this is that um, people.
Let's see. I think that Dr. Moody is frozen, unfortunately. I'm hoping, oh, there he comes.
Here he
Okay,
is. Here he is.
you were frozen for just a few seconds, but I'm so glad that you're
Oh, okay.
back.
Oh,
So,
okay.
let's see. I'm so you were talking about the problem with this is that, and then I think you froze right then. So if you want to,
Yeah, yeah. That people with near-death experiences, I've heard a lot of them over the years say that um, that they don't they don't have a projection of the afterlife like a religious person does, right? Who think accepts it because of their belief. And if you do it on that basis, then that opens up the possibility of rationalization. Like people say, well, I'm not going to grieve about grandma because my religion tells me that she's in a wonderful heaven. You see, and that's rationalization. But people with near death experiences, a lot of them have told me over the years that because of the certainty that there's an afterlife that this experience conveys, that it it does away with rationalization. They can't say, I'm not gonna grieve about grandma because I know that grandma's in a wonderful place because of my religion. They don't have that rationalization. They've experienced it. And so therefore they can't get away from the feelings. I've heard people say, well, I know that my grandma's all right because, but the trouble is I miss her. So I think in a lot of cases, what the near-death experience does for people is it focuses the attention on where the grief really lies, which is missing the person.
exactly. I want to just maybe ask you if we can talk about this amazing chapter. So you have different chapters that explain different reasons for the proof that there is life after death, or and near-death experiences, more importantly. And one of the chapters, I'm just looking for the name of it, is called the Light, Mist, and Music chapter.
Yeah.
And in that chapter, it was really exciting for me to read that chapter because it started out talking about the fact that one of the most compelling cases that you've studied for these near-death experiences happened on both ends. It happened both with the gentleman who was in a car accident, as
Right.
well as the doctor and the nurse who was present as well. And I was excited to hear that it was, of course, Jeffrey Olson and Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll. And I was
Right.
going to ask Dr. Jeff to unmute. He's one of our keynote speakers again at our conference. And so maybe you could say a
Yes.
little bit about this though before he comes on.
Okay, I did ask him to unmute Elizabeth, and he is unmuted.
Okay, good. So maybe Dr. Moody, you could say something about this, and it's
Yeah,
yes,
Jeff O'Driscoll is an eminent emergency room doctor. And that's, he's been in that specialty for a long time. And some years ago, Jeff Olson, who is a graphic artist, was in a horrific car crash in which his leg was smashed off and he almost died. And his wife was instantly killed, along with a child, sadly. But Jeff O'Driscoll, the doctor, that evening, or that when Jeff Olson went in, went there into the area where Jeff Olson was being treated and had a conversation with Jeff Olson's deceased wife. And learning about that case, it came in a time where I had been increasingly baffled about what I was hearing. And so I think that the experience of the two Jeffs, it kind of put me over like I just said, well, okay, I give up. I can't think my way out of this. My way of I am a genuine skeptic. But sadly, the people who call themselves skeptics are not skeptical enough to look up the word in the dictionary. But if they did, they would find a view that's very different from the one they espouse. Somebody who says, "Oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain." Well, that statement is a self-contradiction, because what skepticism, which was founded by Pyrrho after Aristotle, is that um, uh, skeptical inquiry is a way of applying logic in such a way that you ask every question, you really bear down and you think it through as clearly as anybody could, but then in the end you refrain from drawing a conclusion. That's what it means. And the reason is that they found that if you do this consistently, you open new powers of your mind, but also because if you think of it geometrically and everybody else is rushing to get to the conclusion, but your technique is to avoid a conclusion, then you see things along the side pathways that nobody else missed and everybody else missed because they're running in the same direction. And so if you feed that knowledge back through the statement that the so-called skeptics make. Oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. To translate that, what the person is saying is, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. It's an outright self-contradiction. But I am a skeptic, and where I've come is I give up. I mean, I realize the logical difficulties in drawing a conclusion, although I think those are now ameliorated greatly. Um,
Well,
but
I was going to ask if maybe we could have Dr. Jeff talk a little
right,
bit about this experience and the effect that it had on him moving forward in terms of having had this shared death
right,
experience
yeah, it's a
um,
phenomenal story.
with Jeffrey. So are you there, Dr. Jeff? I don't see you, but I want to.
Yes, yes, I am here,
There you
There
are.
he is.
Hi
and
there.
and I'm grateful to be invited. It's wonderful to see Raymond again. We haven't seen each other for a while, although we communicate occasionally by phone, and it's wonderful to be part of this discussion. I, unlike Raymond, was probably not as skeptical as him. I was very uh, steeped in science and medicine, of course, but I'd also had experiences since childhood that made me open to spiritual events as well. My experiences started shortly after the death of my brother in a farm accident when I was just a month before my 12th birthday. And my brother came to me a number of times through the years. And so by the time I got to the emergency department, I had had similar experiences with deceased people. And so the experience I had with Jeff Olson and his deceased wife, while brilliant and wonderful, it wasn't entirely new for me, and it wasn't entirely shocking for me. What was shocking for me was 25 years after I stopped practicing medicine, which I'd done for 25 years, I wrote my book, I shared some of my experience, and I started speaking publicly about it. And what shocked me was one day my phone rang, my mobile phone, and it was Raymond Moody calling. And he told me he'd been a skeptic researcher, an objective scientific researcher for 40 years. And he maintained his skepticism about an afterlife. He wasn't quite ready to admit that there was an afterlife until he had heard and read my experience with Jeff Olson and heard us speak about it. And he said, I finally relinquished my reservations about an afterlife, and now it's actually an afterlife. And so to be part of that transition for Raymond Moody, I felt quite honored. Jeff Olson came into my department unconscious, essentially. And while he was unconscious on the gurney, his wife stood above him in the air and expressed her profound gratitude for the care that he was receiving, the medical care he was receiving. And it wasn't until a month later that Jeff Olson was actually awake and alert and conscious, and I was able to share my experience with him. And And that's when he told me that he had left his body while it was still trapped in the car, and had a profound experience with his wife above the scene of the accident when she said, "You have to go back and raise our son," because their 7-year-old son had survived the accident. So I'm just so profoundly grateful for Raymond's pioneering research and exposing people to this phenomenon. And he and I collaborated just recently. We conversed because I'm writing a paper on how frequent are near-death experiences. And if you look at the data that's been published, the papers that have been published on different types of people that have catastrophic injury and illness, you come up with a pretty good workable figure. It's about 1 million people a year in the US alone have a near-death experience. Wow. And cumulatively over a period of time, that amounts to about 5% of the population over time. And we still talk about it as if it were rare and uncommon.
That's right. And Jeff, also with the shared death experiences, such as you've had, when Life After Life was published in 1975, November of 75, in January of 76, it was all over the world. And I was astonished at how fast it caught on, because I had really written Life After Life. My intended audience was medical doctors and psychologists I thought would be interested in this. And I thought that those who read it and were curious enough to, try it out and ask among their own patients would quickly get verification. That was what I was thinking. But the fact that it spread world over in a few months, I mean, I had that took me, I'm a kind of a social phobic person. And I mean, it was quite a stressful event in a way. And what that shows is that the near-death experience went off like that. But we've known about shared death experiences for decades now. But why haven't they taken off? And I've thought a lot about that. See, and what I think it is one thing is a near-death experience, you can kind of distance yourself, right? It's like this other guy, he almost died and he went out of his body and so on. But, and people can keep a distance from that. But if you get to talking about, somebody was there at the death of someone else and they had this experience, then people can more easily imagine that they might be there at the death of someone else. So I think this is a little more unsettling to people. Plus, thanks to Plato and Democritus, who was his rough contemporary, Democritus had just figured out by reason alone that, contrary to our experience of the tabletop here being solid, that it's actually made up of tiny little bits that are too small to see, that he called atoms. And so he wrote about the same time as Plato. Democritus wrote about these experiences. And he said, there's no such thing as a moment of death. And he said that what this is that this is the residual biological activity going on in the body even after the person appears dead. So you see, Lavoisier revised that in the 18th century by coming up with oxygen, right? And so now we say this is caused by oxygen deprivation to the brain. But the shared death experience breaks out of that mold. You can't think of the shared death experience in those terms because the bystanders are not ill or injured, and yet they have the same experience. And so I think that the reasons why that this has not caught on is that, number one, as I said, we can't distance ourselves from it as well. And also because there's just no clear method to talk about it without bringing in the notion of an afterlife.
Yes, there's many theories that people postulate with regards to the explanation for a near-death experience. but to my knowledge, nobody's ever attempted to explain my experience. I
No.
was wide awake in the middle of a busy shift, working in the emergency department on no drugs, not taking no medications, no history of seizures. None of the explanations that have been used to describe or explain NDEs were applicable in my shared death experience, and nobody tries to explain it.
Well, also, I just want to break in. It wasn't just you, it was your nurse, Rachel, as well.
Yeah.
So it was happening to both of you. I'm sorry for breaking in, but
Yeah.
it's doubly,
And
triply exciting, actually.
and
Yes, I should
it's
say, had it not been for that nurse, Rachel's a pseudonym that I use because she doesn't wish to be identified. But if it hadn't been for that nurse, I'd have never met Jeff Olson in a conscious state, because she, a month after the accident, drugged me up to his hospital room and forced me to meet him and share our experience, because I really didn't
yeah.
want to do it.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, the thing is that you're you are like a lot of other physicians, except in one sense, and that is you had the courage to talk about it. I mean, I've just heard this from so many doctors that seeing the mist or whatever it is leave the body when the patient dies, and I've speculated a lot on why physicians used to be so reluctant to talk about this. And what I've come up with is a very prosaic explanation, because a lot of doctors are private practitioners. And if it gets around in the community that they've been talking to the spirits around the resuscitation room, they so I mean, there's some doctors are obviously reluctant to talk about this, but these days it's loosening up, and I hear this all the time. Years ago, my wife and I got a communication from an ER doctor who was called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on. And he said, as this guy was dying, he said the life came up around the man's life, just appeared like as a hologram, I guess would be the word, all around him. And so doctors experience phenomenal things. I knew this oncologist one time who was telling me about how a patient he had for a long time was dead, had died, and the man was in the bed covered up with the sheet, and the family was standing around the bed and with the doctor, and all of a sudden the sheet started moving and the patient sat up and started talking, and then very quickly went back down. But what the oncologist told me, he said, Raymond, he said, unless the other people unless those other people had been in the room, I would have thought I was having a hallucination.
That's
So
Yeah,
amazing. So,
and sometimes it's more subtle, and people talk themselves out of it. I had an oncologist come to me once, and she said how much she enjoyed hearing about my experiences. And she said, I've never had a shared death experience. I've had a lot of patients pass away, and I've been present on a number of occasions, but I never have had a shared death experience. She said, on one occasion, I remember I went to the patient's room just as they passed away. And as I entered the room, I felt him leave. And then she started
yeah,
talking about something else. And I said, whoa, 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 wait a minute.
there you go.
What do you mean you felt her
That's right.
leave? And she said, well, I felt something
The
leave
energy
the
go
room.
through her.
And
Yeah,
I said, well, listen, you had a shared death experience.
yeah.
Uh,
That's when I hear a lot of times people say that as the person passes away, they feel the person or the energy go through their body.
and you, I know I've spoken with you about this, and also William, heads up the Shared Crossing Project, and both of you concluded, and I'm inclined to agree with you, that shared death experiences are probably about as common as near-death experiences.
I think so.
Probably as much as 5% of the population have had some kind of an experience. And if you do
That's
a
right.
bigger, broader survey, half the population in a large survey say that they feel that they have been visited by or received a message from a deceased person. Half the population.
That's right. And what's happening is that an experience that has always taken place, that was recorded by Plato and Democritus, and just uh, uh, throughout history, these have been recorded, but they were extraordinarily rare. But what happened in the 60s and 70s is with the advent of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, now there's a CPR machine in every department store, right? But with the advent of that equipment, suddenly an experience that occurred but was extraordinarily rare suddenly became very common. And what that is bringing about, I think, is that the afterlife is becoming infused with this life. It's like Jeff was saying, it's like the statistics show that practically everybody knows someone, right, who's had a near-death experience. So there's this association network that, there's a significant proportion of our fellow human beings who are walking around this planet with vivid memories of an afterlife. And so the afterlife is becoming infused with this life.
And yet, almost invariably, despite that broad knowledge base, still today, many, if not most people that wake up after an NDE talk in hushed tones as if they're the only one that's ever had
exactly
the
right.
experience.
I was astonished by that. And I was asked by a cardiology group in a town where I lived. They had a patient that had one of these, and they were astonished. So they contacted me, and they would ask me to come and interview all the patients that they had resuscitated. And it was I found that same thing, Jeff, that mostly their patient population, as you can imagine, a lot of them were middle-aged businessmen and that sort of thing, hard driving people. And many of these people had never even heard of this, right? So, I think that those of us who follow the media are under the illusion that all of our fellow human beings follow the media, and it's just not true. There's, even though there's been a lot of writing about this, and in reality, not everybody has heard of this. So it is a surprise to many people when this happens to them. And as Jeff says, they are reluctant to talk about it because they think they're alone.
This is such an incredible subject, and I'm so excited about having the two of you talk about it. And I also just wanted to talk about another huge part of this book, which is the psychomantium, which actually made you very exhausted because you had people coming from all over the world to
Yeah.
be able to do this with you. And I just want to quickly say, maybe Dr. Jeff knows a little bit about this as well, but I think that this is something that parents are going to identify with and maybe want to build one of their own at home. But some of the experiences that you've had with different patients who have had these shared death experiences is they're all very, very exciting. And before you talk about the psychomanium, I just want to say that I experienced something incredibly profound doing mirror gazing when I was living in India. And I believe that I saw the face of my son looking out at me from the mirror, now looking back on this, because I saw someone looking at me that I recognized, but I didn't know who it was. I also want to say that the shared death experience that I had with Morgan truly saved me from having to go through the heavy grief that a lot of people have to experience. So I feel very grateful for that. And anyway, could you maybe just talk about the psychomantium and its
Yeah.
functions,
Yeah.
and also, and thank you so much, Dr. Jeff, as well. We are so grateful to have you on here. So yes, if you could just tell us about it and some of the
Yeah.
different experiments and experiences that you've had.
Well, this all came from the same source for me, and that was that was a professor of philosophy, and from the age of 18, I have studied ancient Greek philosophy, which is the most astonishing story of history. And even though this is going to sound extraordinary, I'm just going to lay it out for you, and I'll tell you places where you can find this information for yourself. In ancient Greece, the philosophers are the people who founded Western thought as we know it. They developed the logic that we have, the notion, the distinction between the literal and the figurative, the notion of matter. All of this was their product. And in terms of their life, when the ancient Greek philosophers were alive, the people who were around them in daily life, if you would have asked them, what is a philosopher? They would say that a philosopher is a person who probes into things up in the air, which meant magical flight. The early Greek philosophers knew about out-of-body experiences, for example. Or that the philosopher is a person who probed into things under the earth. And that was a code word for calling up the deceased. And in ancient Greeks, there were institutions known as psychomantions, or oracles of the dead. And these were places at remote locations where people would take a pilgrimage. And they created an underworld environment, and in which people could actually visit and experience reunions with their departed loved ones. And I had known about this since college, but in 1987 or 8 in Toronto, I found a classical journal which told about the rediscovery and an excavation of the main oracle of the dead. And based on what the archaeologists found there, I was able to piece together what they were doing, and it works. It's basically they had an apparatus for creating what's called an optical clear depth. You can do it by a mirror on a wall and in a darkened room where you don't see any reflections with a light behind you. But the preparation involved talking, basically how I recreated the experience with my graduate students and medical colleagues at first, and then began to use it with people who wanted to consult me about it. But basically, you talk for a while with the person, and you get them to vividly remember the person that they want to see who had died. And what are your best memories? What are the sad memories? What is the unfinished business, and so on? Just pretty much as you would do a grief session. And then put them into this room. And under those circumstances, a high percentage of people on the first attempt will have an experience which they interpret to be a visitation from a departed loved one. This was the most shocking part of this to me, was that initially all of my subjects were my graduate students of psychology, many of whom were already counselors. They were just coming back for further education. And then my medical colleagues, a sociology professor, an anesthesiologist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, that people were just interested in doing this for curiosity. But what I was astonished to find is that people don't interpret this to be like a dream or mental vision. They experience it as a real event, which is very much like what the Greeks talked about too. The second means of evocation of the deceased that was practiced in ancient Greece was called dream incubation. And one way you can do this is, the best way is just to write a heartfelt letter to the person who died and ask all your questions and pour out your feelings. And then you fold the letter and you put it under your bed and you just forget about it. And in many cases, this brings about a nighttime vision. And what people will say is that I have to call it a dream because I was asleep. But it didn't have the quality of a dream. It seemed real. Sometimes people say even more real than real because of the illumination. And these are reliable methods for evoking the deceased that were very well known from antiquity. So the question is, with all the people who would just treasure, 5 more minutes, as we said, why don't we know about this? Well, the church, that's really the main reason, was that even though this practice was in early Christianity, a professor of religious studies at Cambridge wrote me and told me about how the early Christians practiced this, but in the 300s they banned it because then the religion was getting kind of ideological and they didn't want people to be entrepreneurs, as it were. But I mean, it really works, and over the years, it periodically gets rediscovered, um, and it works. I mean, what can you say? I think that this was very well known in the Victorian era in Britain and America, and I have some iconography of from postcards and such of the period that show this, and I find it very interesting that I couldn't find any iconography after the year 1915. What happened in 1915? I'm thinking radio. It's like after radio started coming in, instead of interacting in the living room and gazing into the mirror and such, people would, first listen to the radio and then watch TV. I think that's probably the main reason why this procedure, which was very well known in the Victorian age, kind of dropped out.
Well, that's fascinating. And I just want to say that people are wondering if you would be bringing through someone that you don't necessarily want to bring through by doing this mirror gazing. Does that happen very often?
That's a very interesting question. About a quarter of the people that I have guided through it say that in addition to, or rather than, the person they prepared to see, they see some other deceased individual known to them. And the first person that this happened to was one of my own graduate students. And she came and prepared all day to see her husband, who had died 2 years before. But in the event, it was her father who came. And on reflecting on this later, she said, Raymond, she said, I've reflected on that. And she said, the person I wanted to see was my husband. But she said, as I reflected on it, I realized that the person I needed to see was my father. And that's generally what people say, that it seems to go not necessarily what you would wish, but rather on what you need.
So nobody that you've spoken to during these studies, because this is one of the questions, has experienced any negative energy
Oh no.
in terms of obviously
However,
the wrong.
the preparation is very important.
Yeah.
It's like you're talking with the person about grieving and all. So I mean, I would never terrify to somebody, but my point is that it's not just the time in the mirror room, but it's the whole process that is the procedure.
Exactly. And the study that was done that you start out with in Palo Alto, which was called at the Center for Consciousness,
That's
um,
right.
I think that the findings there were 100 people that took place in this study. And it's, if it's okay, I'll just give the statistics.
Yeah.
63 reported contact with the deceased,
Mhm.
34 reported having mental conversations with the deceased, and 92 had a decrease in grief, which is something that all of us aspire to have. So, and
Yeah.
this was after one time, or I'm not sure how many times they actually did do mirror gazing, but this
Yeah.
was.
Well, what happened with that, Elizabeth, is that at the time, it used to be the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. And in 1994, Arthur Hastings, who was the director of the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology at that time, sent a couple of folks from the Institute out to my place, and I taught them how to do this. And then they took it back, and Arthur set up a study of it. And there's at least 2 studies that he published. One in the journal Omega, the Journal of Death Education, And then the later one was in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. So he published two very interesting studies on this. A number of people have replicated this over the years. I mean, it's just not hard to do, is it? You know, it sounds impossible to call up the spirit of the dead, but in fact, it's really kind of easy. I think that that the reason why this doesn't catch on, you see, is that society doesn't know how to process this. You know, society has a certain amount of vested interest in keeping the veil intact, right? I mean, if the afterlife world is mixing up with this world, things would get confusing. So there's a psychological need for people to deny this. But I mean, the psychological reality going back to the ancient world, and one of the funniest stories about this to me is a guy named John Dee, D-E-E, 1527 to 1608, I believe, were his dates. And he lived in Elizabethan England, and he was a very famous mathematician. And he was a pioneer in special effects in the theater, and just an immense man of learning. And he was an assistant to Queen Elizabeth, and he was her intelligence agent in effect. I actually was consulted by the CIA a couple of times, and the reason I'm saying that is, folks, these are the nicest folks in the world. Like, you know, you hear about. Before I knew anything about the CIA, I thought they jumped out of airplanes and off the top of trains and such. But no, they asked me to come to talk to them about this, and I found out that they are nerds like me. So this is the nerd brigade. And one of the intelligence officers there was telling me that um, they that some of the principles of intelligence work that they still use was devised originally by John Dee. And he, for example, he discovered that you don't get the best intelligence from within country X from within it, but you get the best intelligence from the surrounding countries where the dissidents go, and things like this. But John Dee was also an expert in archaeology, an early archaeologist, and he would go around England inspecting old monuments and trying to figure out who built them and for what. And so when the Spanish went to Mexico and did their raid, uh, some of the things they brought back from the Aztecs were these scrying mirrors, these obsidian mirrors, which the Aztecs would use to gaze into the mirror. And so one of them fell into the hands of John Dee, and he found he could do it. So over a period of years, he carefully documented all of his interactions with the spirits and how the spirits would come out of the mirror and so on. And when Queen Elizabeth nicknamed him Eyes, E-Y-E-S. And when in his era, mathematics was still not clearly distinguished from magic. So John Dee his favorite number was 7, which he thought conveyed powerful magical forces. So when he signed his secret communications to Queen Elizabeth, he would do it by putting 2 circles side by side to represent eyes, with the 7 over into the side of it, 007. And Ian Fleming acknowledged in an interview he gave once that John Dee was one of the people he had in mind when he devised the character of James Bond. So this procedure is very well, it's known to cultures all over the world. But I think for sociological reasons more than anything else, people just don't want to have to handle this.
That is so fascinating. And I just want to say that we don't have a lot of time left, unfortunately, but I really would love for you to come back because we have so many questions that are excellent questions in the chat box. And one of them, actually, maybe we could talk about this before signing off. But I also, before we do that, I wanted you to just tell people about these seminars that you're going to be holding.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, basically, about 3 years ago, I almost died. I mean, it's kind of a miracle that I lived. They think if I'd gotten to the hospital, just a while later, I would have been gone. And it's taken me quite a bit to recover from this. I'm still not back to myself. And in the meantime, I got the two most wonderful kids ever. Carter is 25, Carol Ann is 23, both of them adopted at birth. And they both have challenges, as we all do. So I'm trying to provide something to leave for them. So basically, what I've devised is this program called Swan Song, and it's putting together all of the things I've learned about the afterlife, and the whole title of it is Swan Song, a a new logic for proving the afterlife. And what this does, it takes 2 days, but I have all these exercises and so on. It takes people through to an entirely new vision of the afterlife, which makes it possible to study it in a genuine manner. If I could just sort of sketch out this, I've been working on this since I was a philosophy professor, knowing full well that eventually somebody who had studied my logic would come up, would have a near-death experience and would be able to talk about it in a new way. It's already happened. So if I can abbreviate this, how do we know it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri, right? Well, the reason we know that is that even though for ages people had thought that you can never tell the distance to the fixed stars, by the 1840s, they were getting up to the measurements were close enough they could realize that since it's 186 million miles across the orbit of the Earth around the sun, that if you measure the angle here very carefully and then wait exactly 6 months and measure the angle again, that would be a difference. And it's called parallax. And that enables you to calculate the distance out there. What I have devised is a way to do that with the afterlife. And it's already worked. I've had this very wonderful man who had taken my logic, who then subsequently had a near-death experience and confirmed exactly what I was saying. So the point of this is I'm doing this just because I love to do it. To tell you the truth, this is bringing together all the stuff I taught my philosophy classes over the years together with a whole new bunch of material. And so I have to limit them to 10 people at a time because I need to really closely I need to go to get to know everybody individually for this, because it will have lasting consequences in people, as I've learned for a long period of time. And so I'm doing them. They're 2 days, and I have to do them here in Sarasota, Florida. I can't fly anymore because of my health. So that's what I'm doing. I have to charge for them, by the way. I've lost a lot of money on it. I'm a terrible businessman, to tell you the truth. So I've just put a lot of money into this. So I have to charge for it. But I wish I could do it just free, but because I love doing it. But that's what you're mentioning, Elizabeth.
These
Yeah.
are going to be over a few weekends this summer, actually, called Swan Song, a new logic for proving the afterlife. And they're going to be limited to 10 people, which is incredible. And I think that this is going to be so exciting for people to be able
Thank
to
you.
do. So hopefully we'll be able to get more information through you
Yeah.
to our parents coming
And
up.
feel free to share my phone number, Elizabeth, with anybody who wants to do this.
Okay, I
I'm
will.
just, yeah.
And I just, I'm so excited that you were able to be on here, as well as Dr. Jeff, who was able to talk about his own experience. So it's so fascinating. But there are lots of questions in the chat box that are related to what we've
Yeah.
discussed today. And as I say, I would love for parents to be able to ask them
Oh
another.
yeah, I would, this is what I love to do. So yeah, I'm just now the one difficulty for me is that due to my Asperger's syndrome, I'm totally inept with computers. I write all my books with pen and paper, but
Well,
I'm capable of using a telephone. So
I'll make sure to let people know. And then I'm so grateful to you. I'm so grateful to Dr. Jeff. I just want to say that Jeffrey Olson was on earlier as well. He wanted to be on here with us, but unfortunately he had a meeting that started exactly at the same time. So he's with us in spirit as well. And as we always do, we ask everyone to unmute and say thank you and good evening. But Irene, did you have something that you wanted to say
Just
before?
thank you. Just thank you. Thank you for being here. We look forward to having you again.
Oh,
Just thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
and
Thank
again,
you.
Thank you, Dr.
Very
Moody.
much.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you,
Thanks very
Dr.
much.
Moody.
Thanks
Thank you,
very
Dr.
much.
Moody.
Thank you, Dr. Moody.
Very much.
Bye,
Dr.
everybody.
Moody. Love
Thank
you.
you, Dr.
Thank
Moody.
you.
Thank
You're
Bye.
amazing.
Love you.
Thank you.
God
I could listen to you for hours.
Yes. Yes.
Yes,
so
hours.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Everybody's saying thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
bye, everyone. Thank you, Dr.
Bye. Thank you.